Well, do any of you remember where we were in New Testament? We were looking at the Synoptic question. Do you understand what we were saying? Well, do you want me to review you or you to review me then? No, I'm serious. I want to know if you understand. It's a real complicated question. We've just barely gotten into it. And we're not going to go that far. I want to have another message on it this morning and some of the proposed theories by New Testament scholars to this, what they call problem, the synoptic problem. And then after that, I'd like to go into what I feel are some of the biblical solutions to it all. But you could just go on and on. So much has been written on the subject. It's a real formal, technical question. It's kind of a watershed question, too, in New Testament studies. You find out, well, this used to be the case in the olden days. You found out in a hurry in the way you'd answer that question whether or not you came down on the side of the liberals or the side of the conservatives. But today, too often, we're finding the conservatives trying to speak out of two sides of their mouth. And they're adopting a lot of these redaction and form criticism techniques, saying, well, we're not really hurting Scripture, but we're learning something from the liberals, the proper way to understand how the gospel stories came together in this final written form as we have them, called the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in the process and in borrowing some of the things from the liberals, I think that they've been burnt. Rather than burning their bridges, they've been burnt. Well, it probably wouldn't serve a lot of purpose for me to ask you some questions. Let me just review briefly, because I never finished the whole message last time. We said, if you can get this, then you're going to get the majority of it. Let me say this before I do that. The synoptic question, since it is a question that concerns three different books, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then the way you normally see it discussed in any technical fashion is with elaborate charts. You almost have to have a harmony or a synopsis of the Gospels. You have to have the three there beside each other so you can see exactly what the similarities are and exactly what the differences are. And then you'll have, any book I have on it has chart after chart after chart, listing where Matthew and Mark and Luke agree and where they differ, and then if Matthew and Luke differ from Mark, where Matthew and Luke differ from Mark but agree with one another. You'll understand all of this better this morning also. And then also not only where they differ with Mark but agree with one another, but where they differ from Mark and differ from one another. Of course, all three of them differing from what John has in his gospel. That's not our concern, just the synoptic gospels. That means seeing to the same eye, to have a common view or to see together the life and ministry of Jesus. But the synoptic question is basically a question as to the differences and similarities in the three Gospels. And I gave it to you in the conclusion last time like this. This will probably be at the very end of your notes last time. I said that really it's a twofold question. Number one, if the synoptic Gospels are totally independent of each other, then how can we explain the many similarities, even to verbal agreement in places? If they're totally independent of each other, then how can we explain the many similarities even to verbal agreement? So one would want to hesitate saying they are totally independent of one another. You may want to say that they're independent, but totally might be too strong of a term. And then secondly, if, on the other hand, they have a literary relationship to each other, the similarities would tend to lead us to that conclusion. Then how can we claim, or how can they claim, rather, to be independent witnesses of the gospel? Why would Matthew be called Matthew? Why wouldn't it be called Matthew as borrowed from Mark, or Mark, so you've got half Matthew and half Mark? How can they claim to be independent witnesses of the gospel? And how may we explain the differences? So basically it's a question concerning the way in which each of the writers went about obtaining their materials and writing their gospels. It's a literary question, like the authorship of the Pentateuch. Who wrote the Pentateuch, and at what time, and why different emphases and strands of material in Genesis through Deuteronomy? So did they copy from one another, or did, rather than that, they use common sources that are not extant, that exist somewhere in the midst of history behind the Synoptic Gospels? And I think I gave this to you, and this is the big issue to remember as far as the conservatives and liberals are concerned. It is a question concerning differences and similarities. I said, however, that during the first few centuries after the Gospels were written, there was a synoptic question. It was approached in the 2nd century A.D. That's about as early as you can get. We've got to have enough time for the 4 Gospels, or the 3 rather, to be finished and be available, and maybe churches owning all 3 copies of them. Only when you do that, or unless you've got a fantastic memory, only when you have all 3 of them together can you really begin to look in detail at them and say, now wait a minute, if Matthew is telling us, this story about the centurion, for instance, and then we read it in Luke, well, they don't read the same. Or they do read the same. You've got either issue, you've got both issues. How do we explain that? Is this really Luke we're reading, or did Luke borrow from Matthew? So in the early church, there was a question. The question regarded the differences. The question did not concern itself with similarities. That is because the early church still had the biblical view of the supernatural origin of the New Testament. You see, there's a reason behind these things I'm saying. So since the early church knew the supernatural origin, what was that? A common inspiration by the one Spirit who has one mind.
Amen.
So it would only make sense that Matthew and Mark and Luke are going to be similar in some regards, in some places. For what reason? For this reason, the supernatural origin. There is a common denominator behind Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as well as John, as well as all of the New Testament, and as well as the Old. And that's the one mind of the one Spirit of God. So the early church wasn't concerned about similarities. They were concerned about differences. As a matter of fact, they believed so much in the Spirit's inspiration of the material, it led them to question the differences. If the Spirit inspired Matthew and inspired Luke, and they gave us different accounts of the same event, then how can we explain those differences? It's one Spirit, it was one historical event. There are only so many facts that can be told about it, and the facts about it are the facts about it, not something else. You can't add facts to it. You can have your own interpretation, but you can't add any material that wasn't there. The facts are the facts. There was one story, and there's one Spirit inspiring that. So how do we explain the differences? By the 18th century, the synoptic question had shifted dramatically. Now it has become a question regarding the similarities. A question regarding the similarities. This is real crucial for you to understand, this little distinction. All right, now what's all of our meaning behind this? Well, of course, by the 18th century, scholars don't believe in the supernatural origin of the New Testament. So they've got to come up with some explanation for the similarities. You see, that's the whole crux of the matter here. If you believe in the inspiration of the Spirit, as you did before you ever came here, or maybe heard these teachings or introduced to this question, you don't have any problem with where Matthew and Luke are similar. You say, well, it's one Spirit. One Spirit inspired all of it, so I don't have any problem. Your only question would be, all right, if it's one Spirit, how did he inspire two different things then? And they appear to be contradictory. Someone quoting Jesus and someone else quoting him, and they quote different words. So your only concern would be the differences. Well, that proves you're a conservative then. I mean, here's one of those little neat tests that proves whether you're a conservative or a liberal. But a liberal, he's got to have an explanation for the similarities. He doesn't believe in this one mind of the Spirit who is the force behind guiding the three gospel writers. So he's not too concerned about the differences. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are three different men, so obviously they're going to be different. See, he already has that explanation down. No man writes the same thing as another man. How can we explain the similarities? So it's a question concerning the way in which each of the writers went about obtaining his material and writing his gospel. Now, only Matthew was an original apostle. Mark and Luke weren't. We're not talking about John. So how did Mark and Luke get their material? Did they borrow from Matthew? Well, that's been a prevalent view in church history, starting from way back in the beginning. But if they or anyone borrowed from anyone, then why is it only similar in some places and different in other places? And whenever they differ, then who's right? Let's look at some examples. Let's look at some agreement examples to begin with. And of course, there are as many as there are chapters in the Synoptic Gospels. Or there are more than there are chapters in the Synoptic Gospels. Let's look at an agreement example. In Matthew chapter, I'm trying to determine which one I want to do. Maybe we'll start with Matthew 9. We don't want to just take all the time. No, let's start with Matthew 8. Matthew 8, 1 to 4, Mark 1, 40 to 45, and Luke 5, 12 to 16. We're going to be at a disadvantage if you don't have a harmony or a synopsis with you, because you've got to keep your finger in 3 different places. This is the account of the cleansing of the leper. Maybe we'll just look at a couple of these. Let's just look at Matthew and Mark. We won't have to spread ourselves out over into Luke. When he was come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. Behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. And Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be thou clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus saith unto him, See thou tell no man, but go thy way, and show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. And then over in Mark, and there came a leper to him, beseeching him, and kneeling down to him, saying unto him, If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. Same thing in Mark chapter 1 and verse 2. And Jesus, moved with compassion, put forth his hand and touched him, and saith unto him, I will, be thou clean. And as soon as he had spoken, immediately the leprosy departed from him, and he was cleansed. And he straightly charged him, and forthwith sent him away, and saith unto him, and verse 44 reads the same as Matthew 8 and 4. Another agreement example that is maybe even more outstanding is Matthew 9, verses 1 to 8, with Mark 2, 1 to 12, with Luke 5, 17 to 26. Now, I just want to show you one thing, and maybe you'll kind of keep this in your mind as the outstanding of the agreement examples. In Matthew 9, look at verse 6, if you will. And then compare this with Mark 2 and verse 10. And then over in Luke chapter 5, and verse 24. What's similar? I mean, not similar. What's identical there? And the thing that's identical is remarkable because of what type of part of writing it is. All right, in Matthew 9, let's start there. In verse 6, we know that Jesus is going to heal this lame man. And before he does that, he starts off by forgiving him his sins, and that really upsets the religious leaders around him. And he gives them this argument that, if I've had the power to do this, then to forgive sins, then I certainly have power to heal the body, and healing the body proves that I have power to forgive sins. The middle of verse, the middle of verse 6 in Matthew 9, in parentheses, then saith he to the sick of the palsy. In other words, that's Matthew's own statement there. So we'll see that there's a division in verse 6 between what he's saying to the religious leaders and when he then goes back to the lame man and pronounces his healing. Arise, take up thy bed, and go into thine house. You could have it separated as another verse, Or you don't have to add that parenthesis in. We would know the end of verse 6 wasn't said to the religious leaders. It was said to the man who had need of healing. When you turn over to Mark chapter 2 and verse 10, in parentheses, he saith to the sick of the palsy. Then over in Luke chapter 5 and verse 24, he said unto the sick of the palsy. All three times in parentheses. It's well nigh inexplicable, except someone is copying from someone. It'd be impossible that all three of them are thinking of adding in a parenthetical statement at exactly the same point. It's totally, in my mind, inexplicable, except someone has borrowed from someone else. So the liberals as well as the conservatives have seen things like this. Maybe this is the most outstanding example, although you could just duplicate material like this over and over and over again, where the similarities are astounding in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But this is a tremendous one because it's not as though they're telling the same story and we would kind of expect them to report the same thing, but they're telling the same story, and then in their telling of that story, they let us know that what Jesus said was something separate from what he said to the religious leaders, and they do it with a parenthetical statement. And that's well nigh unexplainable except on the basis of some type of interdependence theory. And then as far as, yes?
Is that a variant in it? The bracket somebody added on?
No. That's the parenthetical statement of each of the gospel writers. In other words, they're telling a story, and in the midst of the story, they add their own comment in. And then Jesus said to the sick of the palsy, just to let us know. I mean, you don't have to. It's just a part of their own way of writing. But it's a part of one of their ways of writing, and not all of theirs. I mean, if we all add in parenthetical statements if we're reporting some other account. We report part of the account, and then we add in our own comments on that. So he's quoting Jesus there, and then he adds in his own comment. But we never add the comment at the same place that's the same comment. We'd all add different comments. But these three gospel writers don't. It's one comment added at the same place and added in parentheses. Then as far as different examples are concerned, we might note Matthew 27:37 with Mark 15:26 with Luke 23:38, and we can even add John in on this account, John 19:19. I had this question asked to me years ago in this church. Let's look over in Matthew 27 and verse 38. And part of the answer would come out in a situation like what we're dealing with. We read in verse 38, or let's start with 36. And sitting down, they watched him there, Jesus on the cross. Verse 37, and set up over his head his accusation written, This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. All right, let's get Mark's account. Mark 15:20. I mean, something was written. It's either written or it's not written. It didn't say, now, once upon a time there was a man named John. I mean, there was a statement up there, and somehow it had to apply to what was going on there, his crucifixion. Mark 15:26. The superscription of his accusation was written over the King of the Jews. Doesn't read the same. It's very shortened form. Luke 23:38. Superscription also is written over him, This is the King of the Jews. Some are closer than others. And then over in John 19:19. John's is really different. Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, this was he that said he was the King of the Jews. Well, what was written? I mean, by the time you've read all four accounts, and you thought you were going to get what was written, whenever they all differ, you'll be asking yourself at the end of the day, what was written? Which one of these was written? And yet, if you believe the Bible, you have to say all of them. But we know there were 4 signs posted up there, and a commentary on each of them. There's one sign up there. And here's the way it was written. So we've got quite a bit of difference, I think, on our hands between the reporting or the account of the sign. Whatever this superscription was, it differs between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and even John, because John happens to report that. There is a way to explain that. If you just go back to the Luke, well, you can see some of the other accounts, but in Luke 23, the same verse we read has a hint of the explanation. Augustine appears to have been the first church writer to have dealt in an in-depth, serious fashion with this synoptic question. It came up earlier, as we've mentioned, by the 2nd century. Augustine is the end of the 4th and beginning of the 5th century. And Augustine's view was essentially that Mark was a condensed version of Matthew. That Matthew was written first, Mark followed, and Luke was at the tail end. And that satisfied a lot of people for a long period of time. And no one really dealt in so much detail with the problem again until the middle of the 18th century, where the German critical scholar Lachmann, Lachmann, where Lachmann was the one who gave us our first definite expression of what we now call the synoptic problem. The word actually was used earlier by Griesbach, but Lachmann was the first one to really give us the definite expression of what we call the synoptic problem. Now, there have been many attempted solutions to this. I know that because it is a complicated issue, and I don't mean this in any but a positive sense, because it is a complicated issue, you probably tend to have a rather somewhat superficial answer to it. And so when you hear all these different solutions, you may think, well, of course all that's ridiculous and that, but whenever you're asked, well, what would be your explanation? And you have to explain the similarities and the differences. You'd have to explain differences to the point that when someone is quoting Jesus or whatever was said in the three Gospels in the account as they originally happened, how can they quote different words? How can they quote words so much so different that we know that both things weren't said? And then you'd have to explain, the similarities. And for a lot of people, I don't think the idea of borrowing ever enters the mind, because we've got modern standards against things like that. We've got legal laws against borrowing. You can be taken into court borrowing from someone else's material. That was not true in earlier days. That's a rather recent phenomenon. And so you'd still be left out on your own, perhaps stuck, perhaps not, I don't know, but you'd have to come up with some explanation. So I want this morning to get into some of the proposed solutions for the synoptic problem, which is not a problem, it's a synoptic question for us, but I want to get into a few of these. And I want to preface that with this: most of their theories are based upon one or more of the following presuppositions. And these presuppositions are not necessarily false. It just depends on what you do with them. But most of these theories, and they have been many over the centuries, especially over the past 2 centuries, which have been proposed to explain the synoptic problem, are based upon one or more of these ideas. Number one, the writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, incorporated into their final rescinded gospel oral tradition. Oral tradition. Now that is a whole theory, the oral tradition theory. The first one we'll look at here in a moment. But a lot of the theories contain at least some measure of oral tradition in their attempt to explain, well, that would help explain similarities as well as differences. Similarities because the same story is being told by word of mouth over and over and over again, like Jesus' feeding of the 5,000. Differences could also be explained because oral tradition doesn't preserve anything perfectly intact. Something is lost over a process of time. A second theory, or a second presupposition that theories are based upon is this: the writers utilized previous written documentary sources, which are no longer extant. So this presupposition excludes them borrowing from one another. They used previous written documentary sources. That's not a real bad thing to say. Moses probably used some previous documentary sources that were written. Where did he get a lot of his information, like those genealogies? Genesis 5:1 starts off, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Maybe there was a catalog, maybe there's a list that was still available. No one knows. Of course, you don't want to take that as far as the critical scholars do, or you end up having Moses not write any or hardly any of the Pentateuch. Moses wrote the Pentateuch. We've got a tape or several on that, I'm sure. When we say that, we mean it in a common sense fashion. Obviously, he didn't write the last chapter. He was dead then. He couldn't have written Deuteronomy 34. Some conservatives, because they're hyper, when you say Moses wrote the Pentateuch, then because they already had that theory, Moses wrote the Pentateuch, then they had to somehow find a way to explain Deuteronomy 34. And there was a theory in church history that Moses wrote all that before he died. Well, that's going to an extreme end to try to stay conservative and say that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. We say that he wrote it. We don't necessarily mean every jot and tittle as we have it today. I think Joshua probably wrote Deuteronomy chapter 34. I doubt Moses wrote it. He had a premonition of his death, and so he told about when he died and what happened after he died and how they mourned. That's impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but it's ridiculous. But that's where some conservatives have gone, because they didn't like the liberals saying, well, now, that's the first thing the liberals tried to use, is you guys say Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Now, did he write the last chapter? You say sheepishly, well, no. Well, then how do you know he wrote any of it? Well, now, wait a minute. You just took an obvious thing and made something not obvious out of it then. It's obvious that he didn't write the last chapter. How that then leads to the fact that it's obvious he didn't write any of it's beyond my grasp. The Bible says that he wrote the Pentateuch. But there may have been some things that were brought up to date by redactors in later editions of the Pentateuch. And then a third presupposition is this, the common one: the writers of the Gospels borrowed from one another. The writers of the Gospels borrowed from one another. Okay, now I know that I could be accused, not by anyone here, but I could be accused of not dealing fairly with some of these proposed solutions, because they just go on and on and on, and you've got to have charts and lists, and you've got to have it in the original language, because translations won't do you any good. You can't tell where someone's borrowed or where it's different or where it's similar. You've got to have it in the original, and that would just take us forever. So I'm sure you'll excuse all of that and pardon me for that. We're going to do it all in one message this morning, so we'll be through with this. Let's start looking at some of these theories. Number one, this is all on your outline. If you want to get the spelling of some of these words, I'm sure you can spell most of them. But number one is the oral tradition theory. The oral tradition theory. Now, some bits and pieces of this have been in church history from the beginning. It has a rather illustrious history behind it. But as a theory, an explanation of the synoptic problem, it was first suggested by Giesler in 1818. And it has been held by conservatives such as Westcott and Alford and many others. Now, when I say it has been held by conservatives, I'm talking about the oral tradition theory. There may be some things about each one of these theories that's true, bits and pieces of each one of them. But when the liberals have gotten them all together and made a whole theory, and then this becomes the explanation for the synoptic problem, it never, ever has done justice to the whole issue. So what this claims is essentially the following. There is one direct source for the synoptic gospels, and that was the oral tradition received from the preaching of the apostles. This view is based on about 3 different lines of evidence. As its name is, so is it, though, oral tradition. The stories about Jesus were not written down during his lifetime. They were not written down immediately after his ascension. That was 2 or 3 decades later before anyone started writing anything down. What they first of all did, since they had so many eyewitnesses of all those events, they simply passed the message along by word of mouth, oral tradition. This view is based on, number one, Luke's preface, the first 4 verses of Luke's Gospel, which we will study later. It is based also on a quotation from one of the early church writers, Papias. We will study that quotation later also. And it's based on Acts 2 and verse 42. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, along with Acts 1 and verse 22. Beginning from the baptism of John unto that same day that he was taken up from us, must one become a witness with us of his resurrection. One of the qualifications for the apostle to replace the apostate Judas was that he was an eyewitness of certain events in the life of Christ, notably the resurrection, that he had seen Jesus after his death and resurrection.
For the continuation of this
that he had seen Jesus after his death and resurrection. So this is the so-called oral tradition theory. Now, with each one of these, I'm going to give you some objections, or at least an objection. Objection number one, I would say that stories spread by word of mouth would have been very difficult to control as the church spread beyond Palestine. In one church, in one place, namely Jerusalem, you could probably carry the story on fairly reliably for several generations. In one place with a group of people, all of whom knew one another, knew the events, knew the area, knew the terminology, knew the divisions of Palestine, knew the background in Judaism, who knew all of that, and who knew Jesus in his earthly life, I think that, for the most part, could be carried on by word of mouth for at least several generations before you start having some severe discrepancies creeping into the story. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a church that very quickly spreads far beyond Palestine. And you've got Christians in Rome, and you've got, from a very early point, you've got them in Egypt, and you've got them in Greece, and you've got them throughout Asia Minor. You've got Christians in Babylon, in Mesopotamia. Many of them Gentiles. Of course, none of them having known Jesus in his earthly life. How we could control the accuracy of the accounts of Jesus' life simply by oral tradition theory, I don't understand. I don't think that would be possible, not as the story began to spread that quickly and in that many different places. Then another objection to this whole theory, the oral tradition theory, is that at important points in the life of Jesus, such as his birth and death, where you would expect verbal agreement, if anywhere, these are just the places where the majority of differences occur. Now that becomes a serious problem for many theories, and it becomes an issue for any theory, ours included. At important points in the life of Jesus, where we would expect agreement, these are the very places where we don't find agreement. I mean, if we're going to expect differences, I would expect them to be maybe in all those parables or in all the healings, because who can remember all the details, and you'd get this healing confused with that one, mixed up with another one. But listen, the birth of Jesus or his death, the Last Supper, the Passion, the Crucifixion, the most important thing, we would expect the most agreement concerning the most important thing concerning the life of Jesus. And it's in that very area, the most important thing, the crucifixion, the Passion account, where we find most of our differences. Oral tradition, I mean, that's the whole heart of Christianity. If you were passing the story down by oral tradition, I'm sure they would have all memorized the events leading up to the last week and the crucifixion and beyond. You'd have all that memorized. What would maybe be a little foggy in your mind are the parables, or maybe the healings of Jesus in his 3.5-year ministry basically in Galilee. But when we come to the crucifixion, and we would expect a lot of agreement, even to the point of verbal agreement, we find so many differences here. And of course the same is true with his birth. Not all report his birth, only 2 do, Matthew and Luke. And those who report his birth differ widely. I mean, Matthew is telling us one story, and we hear about some wise men and Herod and fleeing to Egypt and all of this, and we turn over to Luke, and we don't hear any of that business. Over in Luke, we hear annunciation by the angels to Mary. And we see Simeon, and we see Anna, and we see Jesus' circumcision. There's no hint of fleeing down to Egypt. There's no hint of that at all. I mean, Jesus coming into the world, where we'd expect a lot of agreement, you have the greatest differences you can ask for in the nativity and passion accounts. Oral tradition theory, if you're following what I'm saying, wouldn't really be able to explain that. That's where we'd expect the most similarity and the most agreements would be in the important parts of his life, the nativity and the passion account. And there's where we find so many differences. All right, then a second theory is the interdependence theory. The interdependence theory. Now this view was first suggested by Augustine, or a part of it. You get 18 different possible theories for the interdependence theory, and Augustine held one of these. I'm going to diagram some of these for you here in a moment. A Dutch scholar in the mid-17th century is credited with really bringing this view to the forefront, and it's been held by men like De Wet and Bauer, critical German scholars also. You remember a lot of these names. A lot of these that work you see in Old Testament areas worked in New Testament areas as well. Now, it's probably for several reasons. Number one, in those days, people weren't as specialized as they are today, just because there wasn't as much information to have to know and to master in those days as we find today. And secondly, I think your critical theories regarding the Old Testament, which were basically evolutionary type theories, are going to lead one to come over to the Synoptics and deal with what a lot of scholars know to be a problem that has existed in the church for centuries now. And they explain it on the same basis, as we'll see later. It's an evolutionary type theory. All right, the interdependence theory would hold something like this, and there are so many different views, but I'll just kind of sum it up for you. The first gospel writer used oral tradition. The first gospel writer used oral tradition. Now, if you wonder why do we have to keep throwing in oral tradition, that's because of the belief that it took several decades before any of the material was written down. You don't have any Gospels, in 34 A.D. There are several decades during which time the church is growing, the apostles are teaching, the church is expanding, and nothing is written up. You don't have any written Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. So you've got to have some basis of oral tradition. So the first Gospel writer used oral tradition, and then the second and third Gospel writer, second and third in order of chronology, used the Gospel or the Gospels, depending on if he's the second or third writer, before them. Now, there are 18 different possibilities for the interdependence theory. Let me just show you this so you'll understand it better. I'll have to copy them because I guess I could memorize this, but I'd rather leave some of my brain for something else. Okay. Let me see what he calls these. I don't know if he's got a name for them. I see why he has them divided up here. Well, I guess the first group of theories is simply the 1, 2, 3 type theory, that there was only one first, and then there was a second, and then the third came, and they came in strict chronological order. So if we assume that Matthew equals A, Mark equals B, and Luke equals C, then here are the theories. You can have A leads to B underneath it, leads to C underneath it. What that would mean is Matthew wrote his gospel first. By the way, this is Augustine's view. Matthew wrote his gospel first. He had to, of course, borrow some material not only from his own remembrance and understanding of the life of Christ, but from oral tradition. He wasn't everywhere Jesus was. He reports things, remember, where Jesus only took Peter, James, and John. So where did Matthew get his information? He wasn't there. He wasn't on the Mount of Transfiguration. So you see, you've got to come up with some idea, some theory to explain all of this. Even an original apostle wasn't everywhere Jesus was all the time. So you say, well, I know an answer to that. Matthew got his material from either Peter, James, or John. Fine, now you've got oral tradition then. He wasn't an eyewitness. He didn't see it happen. He borrowed some from oral tradition. Mark borrowed from Matthew. Mark wasn't there, and Mark doesn't need to base anything on oral tradition. He gets all of his material from Matthew. This, of course, is a rather simplistic view, because what about where Mark differs from Matthew? Where did he get his material that differs in? It's a real simplistic notion. But this was kind of one of the earlier views. And then Luke borrowed from Mark, which had borrowed from Matthew. Interdependence. They are dependent on one another. And then you see how this can work. You can figure out all the theories. Matthew is first, followed by Luke, followed by Mark. Mark was first, followed by Matthew. What's Matthew for us? A, followed by Luke. Mark was first, followed by Luke, followed by, I'm giving you, I should have called them, well, we had two M's in, so we'd run into problems with M's for both of those. And then you've got Luke coming first, C, he's borrowed by Matthew, A, who's borrowed by Mark, B. Or Luke is first, he was borrowed by Mark, which is B, and then all of that bled into Matthew, which is A. There's one way of explaining something about how the Gospels ended up being the Gospels. Now, if you're thinking with me, you'll see how this doesn't answer some issues. But it answers similarities. It doesn't answer differences, though. But this would be a good answer for similarities. Why is Mark similar to Matthew? Well, he borrowed from it. That's easy. Why is Luke similar to both Mark and Matthew? He borrowed from them. Well, that's very easy to answer. But it's a simplistic notion because it doesn't take into consideration some other things. All right, that's one way you can look at the interdependence theory. Then here's another way that posits, and numbers 2 and 3 will be just reversed, two gospel writers coming at the same time, and the third borrows from them. So here you've got Matthew has been written, and Mark has been written. The reason Luke is like those two is he borrows from both of them. Or you could have Matthew coming first, along with Luke, and Mark borrows from them. Or, of course, you could have Matthew, or Mark, rather, and Luke, and Matthew borrows from them. Or another way you could do this is you could say Mark, or Matthew, rather, came first, and his gospel was used by Mark and Luke. Or you could say Mark came first, and his gospel was borrowed by Matthew and Luke. Or you could say Luke came first, and his gospel was borrowed by Matthew and Mark. You count all of this up, and you'll end up with, by the time we're through, 18 different ways you can believe in the interdependence theory.
Is John ever involved in these theories?
No, he's never involved. We don't know where he got his material. He was a visionary on the Isle of Patmos. We know where he got all of his. He didn't borrow from anybody. I may need a little more room. You got this last group down, and I'll go on and erase this and put the other solutions up here. Interdependence is a nice idea. It helps explain some things. It just won't go far enough for us. Or here's a final group of explanations. Generally, these come in groups. Matthew came first. Matthew came first, and Mark borrowed from him, and borrowed directly from him. Luke borrowed some from Mark that borrowed some directly from Matthew, borrowed some from Matthew that had already been influenced by Mark. So he's got Mark's case of Matthew's gospel as well as Matthew's gospel straight, which means then that Luke must be very similar to Matthew, since he's using not only Matthew, but he's using Matthew's influence as it came through Mark. And then another one, I hate to take your time up by listing all of these, we'll put Matthew up here, going down to Luke, going down to Mark, and Mark borrowing straight. So Mark and Matthew would be very, very similar. And then, you got 4 other possibilities here. You can work it out yourself. You can start with B and go straight to C and a roundabout way through A. Then you put another B on the top and C over here and A. And then you just have to do 2 of them with C on the top. You count that up, I think you've got about 18 different ways that the interdependence theory will work. Let's see, Griesbach's theory happened to be B right here. That makes Matthew and Mark very similar to one another. Of all these theories that I've given you, of interdependence theories, by the way, the most popular one is the one that looked like this earlier. B on top at a single time, which led to A, Matthew, and C, Mark. Through all of the workings of the scholars and the interdependence theory ideas, that has by far come out as the most popular and most important one. Putting B on top, which represents Mark, and Mark's gospel was used by A, Matthew, and C, Luke. Okay, let me give you some objections then to the interdependence theory. Number 1, if we take this in a strict way, like they really mean it, it would destroy the originality of whatever are the second and third gospels. If we take it in a strict fashion, we're not saying they couldn't borrow, but if you take it in a strict fashion, that they did, they had to, and they borrowed everything, and they were done without that material. They wouldn't have known it without borrowing. It would destroy the originality of whatever the second and third gospels are. Either Matthew and Mark, or Matthew and Luke, or Mark and Luke, and you get your combination there. And then, of course, this is the problem that most people have seen immediately with it, and I don't even know why it caught on so strong in the last couple of centuries. People recognize the deficiency in Augustine's view, and it probably should have carried over in their own views. And that is the fact, interdependence will only explain similarities. People borrowed from one another. It does not explain differences. Let me diagram that for you a little better. And this then has led to much more complicated theory. You see, each theory is going to become more and more complicated as we go along, until we get to B.H. Streeter's 4-document theory, and that is a very, very complicated theory. But let's go according to the standard interpretation. You've got Mark coming first. Maybe I would even write the name so you don't get confused with the letters. We have Mark coming first. His gospel was used by Matthew in the composition of his, as well as by Luke. Well, then let's take Luke for a moment. We've got several things still that are a problem. To be sure, there are places where Luke agrees with Mark. However, there are places where Luke agrees with Matthew in material that Mark does not cover. That would be number 1 up here. Luke and Matthew agree. I wouldn't want to say against Mark, because they don't ever agree against Mark if Mark contains the material. But Luke and Matthew agree with material that's not in Mark. So, if they're agreeing on material that's in Mark, then the odds are, this is what the scholars say, they must have borrowed from Mark. All right, what if they're agreeing? Again, we're talking about agreeing. They're agreeing with the material they have that's not in Mark. Well, I think that put some other source over here. Then what's that other source? If they agree on this thing in Mark, and they agree on something else that Mark doesn't cover, what's the source for that? Well, we'll see what the source for that is here in a moment. What they say anyway. And then there are times where, and these are very important times, where Luke doesn't agree with Matthew in the same material that they have. I won't say he disagrees, he just doesn't agree. His material doesn't agree. Well, this little simple theory, Mark came first, followed by, and he was used by Matthew and Luke, doesn't explain that. It explains any similarities that we can have in Matthew and Luke as compared to Mark. It doesn't explain differences. And the differences are of two sorts. Where Luke and Matthew agree on material Mark doesn't cover, where Luke and Matthew do not agree with one another on the material that each of them covers. And then, then you've got a third thing I could put down here. Then what about Luke's material that he has that's not found in either Matthew or Mark? Where they don't even cover the matter at all. Like chapters 9 through 19. You've got almost a whole section there in Luke where he has material that's found in neither of the other two gospel writers. So it's not that he doesn't agree with Matthew in material that Matthew covers, such as the nativity account. It's that he's got material that's not found in either. And then, of course, the same could be said of Matthew as well. He doesn't agree with Mark. Mark doesn't have it. He doesn't agree with Luke. Luke doesn't have it. But he's got something that neither has. Where did he get it from? Interdependence theory would never teach us or tell us that. Now, that theory, of course, is built upon, what was it, the second presupposition I gave you, that the writers utilized previous, or rather the third one, that the writers utilized each other's gospel, whichever one came first, or maybe two of them came first, and the third one, or the second and third one, made a lot of use of that as they compose their own gospel. You with me so far? Let's go to this third theory then. The third theory. The third theory is known as the Evangelium theory. You could just call it the Gospel, Urgospel. The Gospel, it means the same thing, but it's called the Evangelium theory. It was proposed by Lessing and Eichhorn, Lessing, Lessing, by G.E. Lessing and J.G. Eichhorn in the late 1700s. And here's what the Evangelium theory, the Gospel theory holds. It holds that in the initial period, there was one primitive gospel. There was one primitive gospel which was written in Aramaic. It was translated shortly after that in many different recensions of Greek. And from these, all three Synoptic Gospels gleaned their material. So you kind of have in this theory, proposed in the late 1700s, an attempt to explain, and this is what they're finally after, agreements and disagreements, similarities and differences. You would explain similarities on the basis of the fact that there was one original primitive gospel. All of them, if we go back far enough, got their material from that original primitive gospel, which was written in Aramaic, written by whomever we don't know, whenever we don't know, where we don't know. But one original primitive gospel. That would explain similarities. Differences would be explained by virtue of the fact that this Aramaic was translated by different people into Greek, which would give us different translations in. Mark is using from one of these Greek translations or more, and Matthew from one or more, and Luke from one or more, maybe some of them the same, but definitely some of them different. Known as the Gospel, or the Evangelium theory. Well, some objections to this theory. First of all, there's no manuscript evidence for this one ancient primitive gospel. If that was the most ancient, the most primitive, we would think it'd be the best preserved, because why would people ever have allowed that to just disappear? Why would such a thing be lost? That was the original gospel. All the other stuff that we have is simply borrowed material from that. So we've lost the New Testament account of the life of Jesus in. All we have are borrowed accounts of that are unreliable because it was originally written in Aramaic. These are written in Greek, and these have borrowed from Greek translations of the original Aramaic. So for all practical purposes, you simply claim we've lost the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's no manuscript evidence for that. Secondly, there are no patristic evidences of this. No patristic references to some original primitive Aramaic Gospel from which all three synoptics borrow. And then maybe the greatest problem with it is the fact that this is a little difficult to explain, and so I won't even try to go into any detail, but as scholars have looked at, since you don't have that original primitive gospel, the only way you can hope to ever get your hands on that again, is through reconstruction. And the way you would reconstruct that is look at the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and find the similarities. You wouldn't want the differences. You want the similarities. All right, if they're similar, they must have been borrowing from the one original, single, primitive Gospel source. The problem with that is they've tried to attempt this process and procedure of reconstruction. What they ended up with as a result was Mark. If they're trying to find what's similar in all of them, the only thing you can end up with is Mark. Mark is certainly similar to himself. But we've seen almost everything that's in Mark, 90%, is also in Matthew and Luke. So what you end up with is not an gospel, like some unknown lost gospel. Just means something, a previous, an earlier one. But you've got an Mark. And we're not concerned about an Mark because we have real Mark. We still have Mark with us. So gospel equals Mark equals no theory, equals bankruptcy for evangelium theory. And so as a result, another theory was proposed, number 4, known as the fragmentary theory. The fragmentary theory. I don't know if you're going to be able to remember all of this as well as you did authorship of the Pentateuch. Remember, I did tell you that this is a technical question that ranks on the order for New Testament studies as that for the Old. But I don't know if you're going to be able to remember all this because I'm trying to cover it very quickly. Fragmentary theory was proposed by Schleiermacher. Who lived 1768 to 1834. But he proposed this theory in 1817 by Friedrich Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher suggested that the apostles had written down brief recollections of the life of Jesus, and he called these memorabilia. He called these memorabilia. And these memorabilia were the apostles' eyewitness recollections of the life and sayings of Jesus. Now, as the apostles began to die off, then these memorabilia were collected by the early church and arranged according to content, whether it was a miracle story, a parable, a nativity account, a passion narrative. They were arranged according to literary genre. Whether it was teaching or miracles or whatever, they would arrange it according to these different little groups. And then out of these arranged collections of the apostolic memorabilia came the three synoptic gospels. Well, there have been many objections to this. The chief objection, however, is the following. People just don't trust Schleiermacher about anything that he said. And they don't trust him in this area. Schleiermacher was the father of modern liberal theology, but he wasn't only a theologian. He dabbled in New Testament critical studies as well. The objection is this: if the synoptics were all from scattered, broken narratives, I mean, Peter just said, oh, I remember something, so he wrote a little account of it down, and John, oh, I remember something, and Matthew, I remember something, and bits and pieces, it's all just haywire and scattered. If the synoptics were all from scattered, broken narratives, then how do we explain the essential structure of unity in them? So remember this, they are not only, these gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are not only telling us a lot of the same things, they're telling us it in the same way and in the same order. I gave that to you last time, what the gospel writers start off with and what they work their way through and how they conclude. The three gospel writers, the synoptics. And it's just too difficult, I think, to explain it on that basis. How can we explain not only what's in the Gospels, but the structure and the unity of them? In other words, they would have had to, they couldn't have borrowed just from scattered broken memorabilia, and then Matthew, Mark, and Luke just happened to have put everything in that type of order. They put it in that order because of some other reason. Now, one of those technical types of New Testament criticism, form criticism called Formgeschichte, that we studied back in the beginning of this class, that is a new type of fragmentary theory. And that is what the conservatives are really buying into today. Form criticism or Formgeschichte, form history, the history of the form or the formation of the three Gospels, or of anything for that matter, as we have them.
This message will be continued on the following